morning to our YouTube audience on the 27th of March, 2022. Good morning to the in-person community. Good morning to anybody watching around campus on live stream. I'm so excited to be with you, and especially the unmasked, those of you maybe watching some future date. This is a fresh new thing after so long in various forms of confinement. Wow. And a tough subject that returns, as all my subjects do, around every 18 weeks. This week, in thinking about it, I realized I'm experiencing the subject matter in a different way. My subject is suffering. Fun, right? But important, because when people come here to treatment and are encouraged by the history, culture, and urgency of their circumstances, but the history and culture of this organization, which was to place tremendous emphasis on what we call spirituality. If you were a person for whom spirituality and religion were kind of obstacle areas previous to your getting here, then hearing that you are encouraged to approach those fonts of information, you might really be like, yeah, I don't believe because if there was a higher power of some sort, all the classic questions: why do babies die? Why pestilence? Why wickedness? Why my own addiction in spite of my good intent? All the why questions come up. So that has been my historical trajectory with the subject, is to move deeper into where why questions take us. And there's a whole field of theology called Theodicy, which is the exploration of the problem of suffering in thinking about the idea of a divine entity or a world that is infused with the sacred. So there's even a term for the problem, and those of you who know me and listen to me know I like academic stuff because, first of all, that was like my sanctuary. It was my first retreat. I am a person in long-term recovery, and one of the ways I think I survived my early family of origin experience and the various miseries of my unfolding life was to be very cerebral. And when I got into recovery, I had a couple of people especially who were just adamant that I learn to feel and express my feelings. And I'm so grateful for them today, because that has been an essential part of my journey of recovery. And so if you are like me and you are the cerebral type, I would tell you, think about whether you can move from some people say this, 12 to 18 inches is the most difficult jump to bridge. And I think there's a deep truth in that. So, why this week? What threw me off? What threw me off were various encounters with suffering. And one in particular that had a different dimension to how it impacted me. I don't like that we made that a verb, but anyway, its effect on me. So, I'm just going to quickly tick off the kinds of things that were causing me to decide to try and go in a new direction with this topic today. One was a patient encounter, and without violating patient privacy, I will just say this patient shared with me some experiences of suffering which has happened to me in my role. I'm so grateful for it many, many times. But this is a patient who is suffering themselves, watched them suffering, and was caught up in the suffering in a way that makes many of us, if you get caught up in suffering, you often feel like complicit in it, even to the point where you often feel it's entirely your fault, although I don't know that always that's the right place. But anyway, this was a wonderful, beautiful human being, as I think all of us are, who is bearing a tremendous burden from having been so close and so entangled with something unspeakable. I'm also struggling, those of you on YouTube, this is way out of date, but the news is really throwing me. And I'm old enough to remember my grandmother talking about World War II and marching out of Poland. As a child, my grandmother fled Poland. Now people are fleeing to Poland, which is a nice improvement in the Polish-West relationship, but I wake up every morning almost afraid to look and see if it's escalated to a new dimension, the Ukrainian war, and I can't help but struggle. I don't know if you feel the way I feel, but the lever pushers, I wonder how connected they are to the flesh and blood sufferings of individuals who are in the middle of the thing. But anyway, I feel in relation to that. It scares me. It scares me for my grandchildren through my wife, my second marriage, and it scares me through my relationship with you, and it's just scary. So suffering is out there. And then, not to make this all about me, but I will tell you, I don't know, my wife and I had a really profound heart-to-heart yesterday, talking about the week and a half that she had and some stuff that's also going on in my side of our marriage plate. And if I were to give you the laments of the inside Jack and Judy story, you might be like, oh. By no means does it compare to other people's horror in scale, scope, or drama. But I just will tell you, this was the week when everywhere I looked, it was very personal rather than cerebral and abstract and theological. So I had this great professor in my advanced studies in theology. He used to have a great expression of land the plane, Jack. And I feel moved to try and land the plane. So let me tell you about a stupid little experience of suffering I used to have on a semi-regular basis. When I first started working here, I had a townhouse in West Reading. Some of you have visited it and know it, and it was a cute little place, and it had a little covered outside portico where if it was raining you could stand underneath it while you're opening the front door. And just intermittently enough that I would forget, on the occasional morning on my way breezing out the door, I'd open the door and walk straight into an elaborate spider web. I don't know if you've ever done that. I suspect many of you have, but I despise that experience. And it ruined my morning. It's like, wah! And of course, right after that, what I would do is for the weeks following, I would open the door with a broom just to see if there was a web there. But eventually, when there was no web there, I would forget, and then just by the time I'd forgotten, a new spider would inhabit the upper rafters of the portico and think, I'm going to trap that bugger. Like when he comes in and out. I don't know if he or she was sailing for me. I don't think spiders go for human consumption, but in spite of the Lord of the Rings, my favorite epic journey in Shelob, but which are in my ancestral primal memory, but that is this issue, and the reason I bring it up is that as I thought about the patient, the global, the marital, and the personal for myself, these sufferings that were in my foreground and other ones, what struck me was interconnectedness. That suffering is pretty much never an isolated experience. You can try and make it private, but when you shut everybody else out, they experience suffering from your shutting them out. This is one of the things I was not really good at, and I'm still not really good at. It's been a long time since I had a drink, and I say drink, I was a polysubstance abuser, and I have had addiction interaction phenomena and parts of my journey, but if you'll just allow me, I say drink and alcoholic, but I mean the more general case. So I've been a long time in my successful absence from my recovery, but I still sometimes exhibit these character flaws and various sort of aspects which I wish I was a better person about. And one of them is empathy and sensitivity and consideration of others. So my boss is this amazing fellow, Dave Rotenberg, who's here. You guys, some of you heard him present a coin. And Dave and I were talking about a piece of suffering I went through a couple years ago, very significant medical event. And Dave said, here I was like, oh, it was awful for me. And Dave said, wow, that must have been awful for Judy. And it was a really good, because I sadly am going to tell you I need to be reminded of that. It's this bizarre lens I have. It's like the distorted goggles of a mirror where I see my own suffering enlarged, and I think I see hers smaller in some way that's not fair and true. But, because if you love somebody in their suffering, it's awful. And there's this word that we learn here, powerlessness. But there is a relative powerlessness to address a loved one's suffering in so many instances. We often just have to let them experience whatever is unfolding. And let me stay on track, watch the time. So the claim I'm making is that I'm learning here now at this bizarre new threshold in my recovery to think of suffering in a very relational way. And to ask, so what that brings up are role questions. What is my role in relation to this suffering event in current focus? And let me label some roles. I don't think they're always mutually exclusive. I think this can get really fuzzy, but perpetrator, victim, bystander, passerby. Those are the relative, in other words, blood or family or friendship relationship. Those are the kind of ways you get into the web around a suffering event. And to go back to the spider web, the perpetrator may be the spider. If you think about it, the spider doesn't see him or herself as a perpetrator, right? And sees me with the broom as a perpetrator. It is very complicated. This gets really difficult because not only to the victor goes the spoils, but the victor gets to write the story of history. So you get to say, and glorify your own role if you come out of it and demonize the people who were advocating for something, fighting for something on their back. So it's, anyway, let's not get lost in that. What does that have to do with here? Everything. We are moving back to having families come to this campus because they are proximal sufferers to your suffering. And I'm not diminishing your suffering at all. It is awful to be caught up in the misery of addiction. But I do think one of the things that is part of what recovery asks of us is to awaken to the scope of harm, the blast zone of our suffering. And it's not fun. It's hard to look at. So if you are a patient and your primary therapist says, we have a cost letter from your sister, wife, husband, mom, dad, employer, whatever, do you know how many times I hear in treatment team, but they don't want to have it read or they don't want to have it read in group or whatever? Because there's shame and privacy issues and all that sort of stuff. But if I can make a sort of personal plea, I think that engagement of the truth of that is a delaying of an inevitable reality rather than a wise choice. And while you're in a safe container, I would encourage you to have a kind of it's very hard, it's very courageous, but bring it on sort of mentality and heart. Like, and try. It's not fun to listen to what my behavior, how it had effect on other people. Of course not. But it's tremendously important and can be tremendously motivating. When you see a grandchild cry, or you see, my conversation with Judy touched my heart in a terribly painful way about some stuff that's going on. And motivates me to want to be a better human being. And that's not that I don't have that intention every morning, I certainly do, but if I'm not willing to take inventory, then I don't know how I'm complicit and colluding in the scope of harm. And this is a universal issue. It's not just an addiction issue, but it's how I think, and there are many of us who have tunnel vision. We're like focused on whatever the objective is, and it might be career, money, relationship, intimacy, power, drugs, chocolate, cookies, like whatever are those things that we have this impulse to gain, achieve, and win. And some of us have this extraordinary capacity for singular focus. None of you know what I mean, right? But, I will get this at all costs. And in order to bring that to the table, it requires this set of blinders to the scope of how it really is collaterally perpetrating. It's difficult. So, solution paths. One of them, as I was driving up this morning, I have a long drive on Sunday mornings generally, and I was talking this thing through, and I heard myself say, what are the tools of a 12-step model in relation to this that I was just talking about? And I was surprised to hear I was sort of walking through the steps, and I was thinking inventory, amends, prayer, meditation, accountability, and service. I think those were the things I said. That's an amazing toolkit. Like, I sometimes have to be very sensitive to people's desire to not use the 12 steps or think they're not for them or whatever, and I hear people diss them all the time. But I will say my impression often is that people who are disregarding and dissing the 12 steps are not deeply familiar with them. I respect that there are now, and I'm excited that there are now other choices. I think it's like having multiple SSRIs or multiple NSAIDs today, so not everybody takes aspirin, but aspirin still is an interesting medication, and Prozac is still an interesting antidepressant. A lot of people who need antidepressants still end up on the first one that was discovered. And one of the things that I would say that, like, if you want a thing to argue about, like, is really rich and beautiful in Alcoholics Anonymous, is what I just said. It has within it an architecture to cause me, as a follower of its model, to engage the reality of how I have been caught up in a web of suffering, and to move me towards trying to seek, as best I could, sort of ameliorate the harm, and then conduct myself in a way that, through living amends, begins to reduce my impact and may even help other people who I have harmed go, I better let them go. Like, I better let them off the hook, excuse me. But because, and forgiveness from others is not a requirement to this. It's one of the mistakes that I think often people make, is that they're like, I'm being better, so you have to forgive me. Sorry, that's not a fair wager. And one of the things I learned from my sponsor was, an amend I can make is to let somebody stay mad at me. What's another lens through which we can look at suffering? One of, and we're going to hear about the Good Samaritan story in the Christian tradition, which is a great place to look at the scope of harm and who participates in what role and all that sort of stuff. And a disregarded stranger, a despised Samaritan, actually helps the person who is left by the roadside instead of people who you would think should help. And that's kind of the tragic truth, is that often the help you think you should get isn't there. That might be your loved ones, or it might be social services, or it might be, conventional medicine or whatever. And then, but I was going to go to Buddhism, because Buddhism, this is like Buddhism's wheelhouse. Buddhism is focused on suffering as a centerpiece of what calls Buddhism into being. And Buddhism's primary voice in response to suffering, in my understanding of Buddhism, and it's like Buddhism's complex, deep, and interesting, and has various expressions, but I think it's fair to say that compassion is where Buddhism calls me to go in response to suffering. That takes me down a little bunny trail. My friend Marty behind the camera there knows compassion in a Latin sense is to suffer with. So empathy, right? And underlying it all, at the end of the day, what I want to say all of that calls us for, whether it's a 12-step, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Jewish, a Hindu, a Wiccan, a humanist response to suffering. Suffering's call, antidote, and best play is love, not theology. I was coached this by my seminary pastoral care provider, who, Sam Lee, was wonderful, impacted my life. I tried to look him up, and I can't find him, but an amazing, amazing man, had just such a powerful effect on me. And Sam pleaded with us to not explain suffering when we were with people who were suffering, not trot out the book of Job, not give people these platitudes like, God gets another angel or whatever. Because you can get punched, poked in the eye, or just really hurt somebody with these attributions to something that's beyond what I understand. And the two responses that I think Sam would endorse for presence and suffering, but his favorite was silence. Just be there. And I think that's love. I do. I think in some sense love is presence, right? It's intimacy. It's a commitment to shared journeying and experience. And it's I won't leave you. So I didn't plan to finish this way. I have two things to say and then I'll be done. One is that I have a mentor here in recovery who used to talk about suit up, show up, be there, where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there, and do the next right thing. Well, that's love, right? That's a formula for lived recovery. And I think if you want to know as patients or as people on our YouTube audience, like what to do, or those in the alumni community, what do I have to do? Because I don't like this. The problems are all bigger, but I have to show up, be present at the place of suffering, go to its heart, listen to its pain, honor your participation in all this sort of stuff. So what about the old spider web thing? Here's the funny thing I will tell you. I always struggled with my broom actions, and I am the person who, when I find the spider, this just happened to me like a year and a half ago. I was in I don't have the townhouse anymore, but I have an apartment nearby. And I walk into my bathroom, and I think I started the sink, and out from the sink, like inch big, comes this spider. It turns out there are not spiders in your sinks. The spider was in there to find water, so I had to Google and learn all about that because I'm a nerd. But not only is that thing too big for me to kill because I am such a wuss, but even small spiders, my wife thinks I'm just ridiculous. But when we see small spiders, I'm like, I have a plan. I go get a plastic cup, I put the cup over it, I put a piece of something under it, and I nicely take the spider outside and liberate it because compassion, right? The spider's just being itself. It eats other bugs I don't like. And that's the best I got, is do no harm. And stop using. Do anything you can to sustain your recovery or resume it. Those of you who are in our relapse programs, I despise that word, but who are here for recurrence of your illness, I'm proud of you. I think it's awesome that you're here. I think we should be celebrating your tenacity, not dissing your struggle. But I also would plead with you when a team member says something, please try it. Because there's so much at stake. And we can and do reduce harm. Recovery reduces harm. It lessens suffering. It improves the world, one individual and one family and one network of relationships at a time. It's a beautiful thing. When I can't solve the Ukraine, I can't solve climate, I can't solve economics and inflation. I'm guessing you can't either, but I can do a better job with Judy. And I suspect that might be true in whoever is filling the